The ground was still warm when they buried Eleanor Crane. That was the cruelest part. July in Iowa meant the earth gave way easily, the soil soft and dark and rich, the kind of ground a man could work without fighting. Walter Crane stood at the edge of the grave his neighbors had dug for him because he could not do it himself. Not for her, and he felt the heat rising up from the turned earth like a breath, like something alive, like the land itself was reminding him that it did not stop for grief, that it never had, that it never would. He was 62 years old. He had spent 40 of those years working soil just like this. He knew what it meant when the ground was warm in July. It meant planting season was over. It meant the harvest was coming. It meant winter was on the other side of everything still left to do, and winter in Iowa did not wait for a man to finish mourning. Eleanor had been 58. She had died on a Tuesday quietly in the way that some people leave, not with drama, not with warning, but with a kind of finality that made the world feel suddenly smaller. A fever that came in June and did not leave. The doctor from town had ridden out twice. The second time he had said nothing useful, only looked at Walter with the expression of a man delivering a verdict he wished he did not have to deliver. She was gone by the 4th of July. The neighbors came. They always did in a county where everyone knew everyone and distance between farms was measured in walking hours rather than city blocks. They brought food. They brought their condolences in the careful language of people who understood loss because they had all carried it themselves. Harold Finch and his wife came from the farm half a mile east. Old Nels Bjorn came alone from the property to the north, said nothing, shook Walter's hand with both of his, and left. That was Nels. He had never been a man of words. But the grip of his hand said everything. Then they were all gone, and Walter Crane was alone on 80 acres of Iowa farmland with a mortgage that Eleanor had understood better than he did, a cabin that felt 3 times larger than it had the week before, and a winter coming that did not know or care that his wife had just died. He sat on the porch the evening after the burial and did what he had always done when the weight of a problem became too large to carry without looking directly at it. He calculated 20 cords of wood. That was the minimum for an Iowa winter in a cabin the size of theirs. 20 cords of split, seasoned hardwood, stacked and ready before the first real snow. In a good year with 2 people working, he and Eleanor had managed to cut and split 12 cords from their own timber. The rest they had bought or traded labor for, or accepted from neighbors in the informal economy of mutual survival that held rural communities together. This was not going to be a good year. Alone with tools built for a younger man's hands and knees that had been arguing with him since his late 50s, Walter could cut perhaps 6 or 7 cords before the season turned against him. The rest would have to be bought. $4 a cord was the going price. 13 cords at $4 was $52. He did not have $52. He had the land. He had the cabin. He had Eleanor's garden and 2 plow horses and a root cellar half stocked with summer vegetables and a winter stretching out ahead of him like an open hand waiting to take everything he had left. He sat on the porch until the stars came out and did not move. The field crickets ran their noise through the dark. An owl called twice from the timberline and went quiet. The summer night settled over the property with the indifference of all summers, which do not know what they are the last of until they are already gone. Walter sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the dark field and felt the particular weight of a man who understands for the first time without any possibility of comfort that the partner he had been calculating with for 36 years is no longer part of the calculation. He had always been the one who worked the ground. Eleanor had been the one who understood what the ground was worth. Now he had to be both. He went inside. He did not sleep well. He was up before dawn. Raymond Voss began riding past the following week. Walter noticed on a Thursday the way he noticed everything quietly without reaction, storing the information in the same place he stored all information that might matter later. Voss was on his gray mare, moving at the unhurried pace of a man with no particular destination, and he looked at the Crane property the way a man looks at something he already considers his own. Not with greed exactly. With the calm assessment of a man who has already decided and is simply confirming what he already knows. Raymond Voss was 65 years old. He had come to this county 20 years ago with money nobody could fully account for and a talent for identifying distress before it became visible to everyone else. He was a tall man, lean in the way that some men stay lean into old age, with silver hair cut close and the kind of steady, unreadable eyes that made people in the general store speak carefully around him. He dressed well. He spoke well. He was never rude. He was also by the private accounting of 11 families who had sold him land over 20 years, something considerably colder than rude. He did not buy land through force. He was too intelligent for that. He waited, he watched, he let circumstances, bad harvests, sick livestock, dead husbands, brutal winters do the work that cruder men would have tried to do themselves. And then when a family was standing at the edge of what they could endure, Raymond Voss would appear at the door with a fair price and a sympathetic expression and the quiet certainty of a man who knew the answer before the question was asked. He had bought 11 farms in this county over 20 years. Not one of the previous owners had spoken well of him afterward, but none of them had been able to say exactly what he had done wrong. Walter watched him ride past and felt the particular coldness that comes not from temperature, but from recognition. He had seen that look before. Not on Voss specifically, he had not paid much attention to Voss before July, but on men like him. The look of someone who has identified an outcome and is simply waiting for events to catch up to his conclusion. Voss was counting. He was calculating the same numbers Walter was calculating, arriving at the same conclusions, and adding one column that Walter did not have patience. Voss could wait. He had money. He had time. He would ride past every week and watch for the woodpile that wasn't appearing, and the man who was aging and alone, and he would wait until February turned the mathematics against any other solution. Walter turned back to the field he was working and did not look up again. He did not look up, but he did not forget. The letter was in the bottom of Eleanor's sewing basket. He found it 10 days after the burial, going through her things in the careful way of a man who is not ready to go through someone's things, but understands that it has to be done. Her needles, her thread organized by color, in a way that had always quietly amazed him. She had never needed to search for a color, had always reached directly to the right spool, as if the organization existed in her hands rather than in any visible system. A photograph of her mother taken in Pennsylvania before the family moved west. A small pressed flower he did not recognize. A folded piece of paper he did not recognize. He opened it, standing at the kitchen table in the afternoon light that came through the window. She had always insisted face south because she liked the way the sun moved through it in winter. It was a letter from Raymond Voss, dated May 12, 1854, 7 weeks before Eleanor died. It was addressed to Eleanor directly, not to Walter, and it was in its own way a masterpiece of careful language. Voss expressed his admiration for the Crane farm. He noted with apparent sympathy the difficulty of frontier life for a couple of their age. He mentioned almost in passing that he had spoken with Eleanor briefly at the dry goods store the previous month and had been struck by her practicality, her clear-eyed understanding of their situation. He said he admired women who understood practical realities. He said it as a compliment. He meant it as leverage. He offered $300 for the 80 acres. He said Eleanor could discuss it with her husband if she wished, but if she found herself in a position where a quiet decision needed to be made before discussions became complicated, he was available. He had signed it with a phrase that sat at the bottom of the page like a stone. Some decisions are kinder when made early. Walter read the letter twice. He set it down on the table. He picked it up and read it a third time more slowly, the way a man reads something he wants to be sure he has understood correctly before he decides what it means. Eleanor had not told him. She had kept this letter in her sewing basket for 7 weeks and said nothing. He did not know if she had been considering it. He did not know if she had been protecting him from it. He did not know if she had already written back, already made arrangements, already decided something that her death had interrupted. He thought about the last weeks of her life, running through them now. With this new piece of information in hand, the way you reread a chapter of a book after you've learned something in a later chapter that changes what the earlier chapter meant. Her quietness in the mornings. The way she had sometimes looked at him with an expression he had read as tiredness and was now not sure he had read correctly. The conversations about the farm's finances that she had initiated and then let drop as if she had started them to say something and then decided against saying it. He stood at the kitchen table for a long time. Then he folded the letter, carried it to the stove, opened the iron door, and put it in the fire. He watched it catch. He watched the paper curl and blacken. and the ink disappear. He watched it become ash. He closed the stove door. Whatever Eleanor had been thinking, whatever conversation she had been having with herself in the last weeks of her life, it was between her and the ground she was buried in now. He was not going to reconstruct it. He was not going to assign her intentions based on a letter she had kept, and not an answered and not shown him. But one thing was clear. Raymond Voss had been circling this farm since before Eleanor was cold. He had looked at a sick woman and seen an opportunity. He had written to her in private because he understood that privacy and isolation and the particular exhaustion of a woman who knows her husband cannot carry more were the tools of his trade. Walter Crane was not going to give him what he was waiting for. He did not know yet how he was going to avoid it. He did not have a plan. He had a decision, and sometimes a decision is the only thing that stands between a man and surrender. He stood in his kitchen and made one without ceremony, without anyone watching, without any particular confidence that he could keep it. He was not selling this land, not to Voss, not to anyone, not in January when the money ran out, not in February when the wood ran low, not in March when the last of everything was exhausted and a man might sign anything just to stop the cold. Not ever. He went back outside and picked up his shovel. The hole behind the cabin had been bothering him since the burial. It was on the north side, half hidden by the overgrowth of a sumac that had taken over that corner of the property over several seasons of neglect, not because Eleanor had neglected it, but because the sumac grew faster than a woman with the other work could manage. A pit roughly 5 feet across and 3 feet deep with the irregular edges of hand digging rather than the clean lines of anything planned by a man with surveying experience. Eleanor's shovel was leaning against the cabin wall nearby. The blade was worn in a way that told him it had been used recently, repeatedly, with force, the kind of wear that accumulates over weeks of serious digging, not days of light scratching. He stood at the edge of the hole and tried to understand it. Eleanor had not mentioned digging. She had not mentioned any project behind the cabin. In the last months of her life, when her strength was already leaving her, when the fever that would take her was already doing its preliminary work of slowly dimming what had always been a very bright light, she had apparently been out here in the early mornings or the evenings when Walter was in the fields moving earth by herself for reasons she had not explained. He climbed down into it, 3 feet deep. Hard clay walls shored up slightly on one side with stones she had carried from the creek stones selected with the care of someone who knew what she was looking for, flat, broad, good for lining. The floor was packed flat deliberately, the way you pack a floor when you intend to put weight on it, not the rough, irregular bottom of a hole dug in frustration or grief or restlessness. She had been building something. Not randomly, not to occupy her hands or tire herself into sleep. With purpose, he did not know what it was. But Eleanor had not done things without reason. In 36 years of marriage, he had learned that she thought 3 steps ahead of everything she put her hands to. The garden she had planted their first year on this property had been arranged in a pattern that took him 4 seasons to understand, was designed to shade the root cellar entrance from the afternoon heat, keeping the temperature inside more stable through the hottest weeks of summer. She had known that before she planted the first seed. She had never explained it. He had simply noticed one August that the root cellar was cool when everyone else's was not, and worked backward to understand why. He stood in the bottom of the hole she had dug and looked at the walls she had lined with stone and did not know what she had been building. But he understood in the bone-deep way of a man who had been paying close attention to the same woman for most of his adult life that she had been trying to solve a problem. The same problem he was trying to solve now. He climbed out and stood at the edge and looked at the dimensions of what she had started. 3 feet deep, 5 feet across. A stone-lined floor, a shovel leaning against the wall, the beginning of something that had a shape he couldn't yet see. She had left him something to finish. He didn't know what it was. But he picked up the shovel anyway because picking up the shovel was the only response that made any sense, and carried it to the tool shed and hung it in the place where he kept his own and went back to the field. Nels Bjorn appeared on a Wednesday morning in late July, walking across the field from the north property line with the unhurried stride of a man who has nowhere to be but has decided to be somewhere anyway. He came without announcement and without the food that most neighbors brought as entry currency. He came with his hands in his pockets and his hat low against the morning sun and the particular economy of movement that had always marked him. Nothing wasted, nothing performative, every step exactly as long as it needed to be. He was 74 years old and looked like the land itself had made him broad-shouldered, despite his age hands that seemed oversized for his body, the knuckles enlarged from decades of grip and cold, a face weathered to the color and texture of old oak bark. He had come to Iowa from Norway 30 years ago, had built his farm from nothing in the way that the immigrants of that generation built things, which was to say, by working in a manner and at a duration that made the native barn farmers shake their heads and occasionally their fists. He did not socialize much. He repaired his fences before they needed repairing, and his roof before it needed repairing, and his relationships with his neighbors by the simple method of never requiring anything from them that he could provide for himself. Walter had known him for 11 years and had spoken with him by his own rough estimate perhaps 200 times. Most of those conversations had been short. Nels walked to where Walter was standing near the back of the cabin, looked at the hole in the ground, and stood for a moment with his hands in his pockets, studying it the way a man studies something that tells him more than its appearance suggests. She started this herself, Nels said. Found it after, Walter said. She never mentioned it. Nels nodded slowly the way he nodded when something confirmed what he had already suspected. He walked to the edge of the hole and looked down at the stone-lined floor. He walked around the perimeter, studying the walls, pressing his boot against the soil to test its compactness. He crouched at one corner and looked at the angle of the shoring stones, then stood again. In Norway, he said, we keep wood underground. Walter looked at him. Not roots, not food. Nels crouched at the edge of the hole, his big hands resting on his knees. Wood, firewood. We dig chambers into the hillside or down into the earth, and we stack the wood inside. The ground holds the temperature constant. The air keeps moving if you build it right, and if the air keeps moving, the moisture does not accumulate. He paused, looking at the stone floor Eleanor had packed. The wood never gets wet. Walter was quiet for a moment. Never mignon. Rain falls on the ground above it. Snow piles up. Ice comes, ice goes. Thaws, freezes again. The wood inside stays the same as the day you cut it. Same weight, same color, same moisture content. Nels stood up, brushing the clay from his hands. Wet wood burns half as hot, gives twice as much smoke. A man who burns wet wood all winter, he is cold and half blind from the smoke, and still running out of wood by February. Walter looked at the hole. He looked at the north wall of his cabin, calculating distances. He looked back at the hole and thought about chambers and depth and the weight of frozen ground pressing down from above and what it would take to hold that weight. She knew this, he said. I told her. Nels said simply. In spring, she came by one afternoon when I was stacking timber on my north side. She asked me what I thought about winter wood storage in this climate. I told her what my father taught me. What his father taught before that, back further than either of us could trace. She listened the way she listened to everything completely, and then she asked the right questions. He paused again. I did not know she had started. Walter was still looking at the hole. He was calculating. The numbers that had seemed impossible, 20 cords, $52 alone at 62 in the worst climate he knew, were beginning to rearrange themselves around a different possibility. Not easier, harder in many ways, but different. What happened, he said slowly, in 1820? The question landed in the space between them and sat there. Nels was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the field behind them, bending the corn in a slow rolling wave, and somewhere up the property line, a crow called and went quiet. My first winter in this country, Nels said at last. His voice had changed, not louder or softer, but somehow more careful, the way a man speaks when he is selecting each word with particular attention. We did not know. We had been told Iowa winters were cold, but we had been cold in Norway too, and we thought we understood cold. We stored wood outside like everyone here stores it, because that was what everyone here did. And we were new, and we deferred to what everyone did. He stopped. He looked at the horizon, not at Walter. The crow called again farther away. October came then, November, then the first real storms. The woods sat in the rain and the snow for 2 months before we needed it seriously. By January, what we had left was half frozen and wet through to the center. We could not get it to burn well. What heat it gave cost 3 times the wood to produce. He stopped again. My brother's 2 children did not come through that winter, he said. They were very small. The cabin could not be kept warm enough for very small children when the wood is wet and the temperature is 30 below. He brought his eyes back from the horizon and looked at the hole in the ground. My brother never spoke of it. I never spoke of it. But I never stored wood outside again. In 30 years, not one winter have I stored wood outside. The two men stood in silence. It was the most Nels Bjorn had said in a single conversation in all the years Walter had known him, and Walter understood this and understood what it had cost and said nothing in return for a while. It was the kind of silence that follows a statement so heavy with private weight that it takes time for the air to settle back around it. A cloud moved across the sun. The shadow ran across the field and over them and kept moving north. How large does the chamber need to be? Walter said finally. And Nels, who had been waiting for exactly that question, crouched back down at the edge of the hole Eleanor had dug and began to talk. The plan took shape over 2 afternoons. Nels drew in the dirt with a stick, the way men who work with their hands draw, not in art, not in pictures that aspire to beauty, but in function in the language of angles and load-bearing and drainage. Dimensions. The slope of the entrance tunnel wide enough to drag a loaded sledge through without losing wood off the sides. The ventilation shaft on the far side of the chamber narrow, rising straight to the surface, capped with a wooden cover that kept rain out but allowed the slow, constant movement of air that was the difference between storage and rot. The wall supports timber frames set at intervals calculated for the specific pressure of Iowa clay under winter ice. The floor stone line slopes slightly, not dramatically, but measurably toward a drain channel that would carry any seeping groundwater to a collection point at the far end of the tunnel, rather than letting it pool under the wood. 40 cords of wood could be stored in a chamber 20 feet long, 10 feet wide, and 8 feet deep. That was more than Walter needed for one winter. It was enough for two. Was enough. It was enough to turn a vulnerability, a man alone on a farm with no visible preparation, watched by a predator who understood vulnerability the way some men understand weather, into something that the predator could not calculate, could not account for, and could not see. It was also an enormous amount of work. 6-7 weeks of digging, Nels said, studying the dimensions he'd scratched into the dirt with the point of his stick. Hard clay. The clay here does not cooperate the way hillside soil cooperates. You will need to move it in buckets. Not wheelbarrow. The tunnel entrance will be too narrow for a wheelbarrow. Pile it far enough from the structure that it does not create pressure on the walls you have already built. Timber shoring as you go, not after. He looked up at Walter with the steady eyes of a man who has assessed many situations and arrived at his assessments honestly. You are 62. I am aware of that, Walter said. I am saying it is possible. I am not saying it will be easy. Nothing about what you are planning is easy. But possible is enough if a man applies himself to it without reservation. Most things worth doing aren't easy. Nels considered this for a moment, as he considered most things, without rushing, without performing considerations, simply letting the statement settle until it had resolved itself into something he could evaluate. Then he nodded once with the particular deliberateness of a man whose nods mean something specific. I will help for a few days. My knees are not what they were, and the bending this work requires will remind me of this fact repeatedly. But I can help you start, and starting well is half of building well. Walter looked at the hole Eleanor had dug, 3 feet deep, 5 feet across. She had been sick when she dug it. She had done it alone in the early mornings before he was up, or in the evenings when the light was going, and she should have been resting because she had been trying to solve a problem she could see coming that he could not see yet or could not face. She had not told him because she had not wanted to worry him, or because she had not wanted to ask for help until she had something more substantial to show, or because she had been Eleanor, and Eleanor had always finished things before she talked about them, and this was one thing she had not been given the time to finish. She had left him the beginning. She had left him the shovel. And now, through Nels, she had apparently left him the knowledge as well. We start tomorrow, Walter said. First light. Nels put his stick down and stood. He looked at the hole one more time with an expression that was not quite sadness and not quite recognition, but lived somewhere in the territory between them. She was a practical woman, he said. It was the highest compliment he knew how to give. She was, Walter said. Nels walked back north across the property line, and Walter stood at the edge of the hole in the cooling July evening and looked at what his wife had started and felt something clarify in him that had been murky since the burial. Not purpose exactly, something more specific than purpose, a direction, a next thing to do. An answer to the question the porch had asked him on the evening after the funeral when he had sat in the dark and calculated and arrived at nothing. He went inside and ate. He went to bed early. He was up before the sun. Raymond Voss rode past on a Thursday in late July and saw no woodpile. He rode past again in August and saw the same thing. A cabin, a field being worked, two horses in the paddock moving unhurriedly in the heat, no stacked wood anywhere visible, no logs lying in the yard waiting to be split, no splitting rounds on the block, no chips of fresh-cut oak on the ground, none of the debris that surrounds a farm where serious winter preparation is underway. At the general store in town, where the men gathered in the evenings and the conversation moved between crops and weather and land prices and the particular minor dramas of a county where everyone's business was partially everyone else's, Voss allowed himself a single observation. "Crane's got no wood stacked," he said, accepting his coffee from the man behind the counter. "I ride past every week. Nothing." One of the men at the counter said maybe Walt was buying it this year given his situation. Someone else said he had heard Walt had taken on some harvest work at a farm 2 miles west, which was curious for a man with his own fields to tend. Voss said nothing else. He drank his coffee. He smiled the smile of a man who believes he already knows how something ends and is simply enjoying the interval before the ending confirms him. He did not know about the hole behind the cabin. He did not know about the Norwegian farmer with his father's knowledge and his dead nephews and his 2 weeks of labor in the Iowa clay. He did not know about the chamber taking shape beneath the earth, growing day by day, foot by foot, timber-framed and stone-floored, and waiting to be filled with wood that would stay as dry as the day it was cut, while the world above it went through all the forms of wet that Iowa autumn could produce. He did not know about Eleanor's letter burning in the stove. He did not know about the calculation Walter had made that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with a dead woman's shovel leaning against a cabin wall and a hole 3 feet deep in the Iowa clay that a sick woman had dug in the early mornings of her last spring because she had been trying to solve a problem that she understood and her husband did not yet. He knew only that there was no woodpile. And in his experience, which was considerable and had been confirmed 11 times, no woodpile in July meant no heat in February. And no heat in February meant a man willing to sign anything to make it stop. He rode past on a Friday and tipped his hat at the empty yard and did not hurry home. He had time. He always had time. That was the particular advantage of his method. It required no action from him, no effort, no risk. He simply had to keep showing up, keep watching, keep letting the calendar and the climate do their work. The calendar had never failed him. The climate had never failed him. People were predictable in their vulnerabilities in a way that made his method as reliable as farming and considerably less physical. He rode home in the late afternoon sun and did not think about Walter Crane again until the following Thursday. The chamber was 12 feet long by the end of August. Walter had risen before dawn every morning and worked until the light failed, carrying the clay out in buckets, shoring the walls as he went with timber salvaged from trees that had fallen in the south field over the previous 2 winters. Wood he had been meaning to clear Sal, serving a more immediate purpose than he had imagined when he had left it lying. Nels had worked beside him for the first 10 days, moving earth with the steady mechanical rhythm of a man who has been doing physical labor since he was old enough to hold a tool, saying very little, occasionally stopping to assess the walls with his hands, the way a man reads something written in a language made of density and moisture rather than letters. When Nels's knees finally gave him their definitive verdict on the matter, he said goodbye the same way he had said hello, simply without ceremony, without the elaborate leave-taking that some people use to avoid arriving at the actual departure. He shook Walter's hand. He turned toward the north property line. But before he took the first step, he stopped at the entrance of the tunnel and looked down at what they had built together. He stood there for a moment with his hat in his hands, looking at the framed entrance, the sloped floor, the first section of the chamber visible in the dimness beyond. "Your ventilation," he said without turning around. "When you reach the far wall, do not skip it. I know you will be tired by then and the work will feel done before it is done. Do not skip the ventilation shaft. Wood stored underground without moving air will rot within 2 seasons. It will mold. It will become useless." He tapped the timber framing of the entrance with his knuckle, a single solid knock. "Air in through the tunnel, out through the shaft, always moving. That is the difference between a wood storage and a wood grave. I won't skip it, Walter said. Nels put his hat on. He walked away through the tall grass toward his property, his gait already showing the preference for straight lines over uneven ground that comes with age and unhappy joints. Walter watched him go until he was past the property line and moving through his own field. Then he turned back to the tunnel, picked up his shovel, and went back underground. Alone now, the work was slower. The mathematics of it were simple. One man moves half as much earth as two in a day, and the days were already getting shorter, and the calendar he was working against did not negotiate. But the work was also in a way that Walter could not have explained to anyone without sounding like a man who had developed eccentric habits in grief-sustaining in a way the surface work was not. Down in the clay and the smell of turned earth and old timber, in the particular cool darkness of a place below the world's weather, there was no grief. There was no empty cabin. There was no south-facing window and no absent hand reaching for the thread organized by color. There was only the next bucket, the next foot of wall to shore, the next measurement, the next timber, the next calculation of depth and angle and load. Problems that had answers, work that moved forward in a direction that could be measured. He thought about Eleanor while he worked, but not in the way that grief usually presents its thinking, not the sudden ambush of a specific memory, not the hollow feeling of reaching for something that isn't there. He thought about her the way he thought about the chamber's design, practically with attention to what she had known and what she had started and what she had been trying to accomplish. She had known about the underground storage before she died. She had not told him because she had not wanted to hand him a half-finished thing. She had gone out in the early mornings and dug 3 feet of it herself with a sick woman's body and a practical woman's determination because she had understood the problem before he did and had started solving it before either of them could have said aloud what she was solving. She had left him a hole to finish. He was finishing it. Harold Finch came by in the second week of September. He was 63 years old and had the manner of a man who means well and knows it and has built most of his social identity around the reliable fact of meaning well. He drove a good wagon. He maintained his fences with regularity. He was the first to offer help at haying time and the last to leave a barn raising. He was also, and this was not incompatible with any of the above, a man who worried about things in a way that occasionally made the things worse than they needed to be. He stood at the edge of the property and watched Walter emerge from the tunnel entrance, covered in Iowa clay, from his boots to his elbows, carrying an empty bucket, and followed by the smell of turned earth. And his expression moved through a rapid sequence, surprise, then concern, then something approaching genuine alarm before settling on the expression of determined helpfulness that was his default register for situations he did not understand. "Walt," he said. "What in God's name are you doing?" "Digging," Walter said, setting down his bucket. "I can see that." Finch looked at the entrance at the piled earth to the side that was already a considerable mound, at the fresh timber framing, visible just inside the mouth of the tunnel, the careful work of a man who has built something designed to last. Digging what? Storage. Finch waited for more. More did not come. He understood, as people who knew Walter well, understood that more was not coming, but he tried again anyway because he was Harold Finch, and Harold Finch tried. "Walt, I came by because I wanted to talk to you as a friend." He took off his hat, held it in front of him with both hands in the way men hold their hats when they're about to say something they've prepared and want to signal, by the holding of the hat, that it is being said with genuine feeling. People are talking. You've got no wood. It's September. Every farm in this county has a cord or two stacked by now. People are splitting and hauling, and you've got nothing anyone can see. He paused. Voss has been asking around. He's been very visible about his concern for you. "I imagine he has," Walter said. "You have a son in Cincinnati," Finch said. "Good man. Has a house, a solid livelihood. You could." "I'm not going to Cincinnati, Harold. You're 62 years old and you're digging holes behind your cabin alone, and you have no wood, and winter is coming in 6 weeks." Finch's voice had taken on the quality of a man who genuinely cares about someone and is frightened for them, which is not the same as being right about them, but which is so often mistaken for rightness that the mistake has become a tradition. "Eleanor wouldn't want you to take him." "Don't." Walter said it quietly without heat, without the edge that the same instruction spoken in anger would have carried. He said it the way you close a door that you are going to need to walk through again later carefully without slamming. He picked up his empty bucket. I appreciate you coming, I genuinely do. But I have work to finish before the light goes today and tomorrow and most days between now and November. Come back in November and I'll have coffee on in time to sit. Finch stood for a moment, hat in his hands, studying Walter the way you study someone you are worried about and cannot help, and are not sure whether your inability to help is a failure of yours or a choice of theirs. Then he put his hat back on. November, he said, all right. He walked back to his horse. Walter picked up his bucket and his shovel and went back underground. The clay waited, the tunnel waited. The chamber grew another foot longer before dark, and when Walter climbed out at last and filled the tunnel entrance with the temporary board he used as a door, and walked back to his cabin in the blue light of a September evening, there was no woodpile behind his property, no stacked logs, no visible evidence of preparation for anything at all. Just a temporary board covering a door in the earth. And below it, slowly daily by one bucket and one timber brace and one careful foot of progress at a time, the answer to a problem that Raymond Voss believed had no answer. He went inside. He put water on to boil. He sat at Eleanor's kitchen table and looked at the south-facing window, the one she had chosen for the light that moved through it in winter, and understood something he had not fully understood before. Something that the letter in the sewing basket and the hole in the ground and the plan in the dirt and 2 months of underground work had been slowly assembling into clarity. She had started the hole in spring. She had known by spring that something had to change, that the mathematics of their situation were going to become critical, and that being critical in February without preparation was not survivable. She had not told him because she had not wanted him to carry it while she was still able to carry it herself. She had been solving the problem until she couldn't anymore. And then she had left him the hole and the shovel and the only instruction he needed, the one she had given him without words, the one written in the stone-lined floor and the measured walls and the careful beginning of something she had not been able to finish. Keep going. He finished his coffee. He went to bed early. He was up before the sun. He kept going. The 1st of October arrived the way trouble arrives quietly without announcement in the middle of an ordinary morning when a man is underground and his attention is on the next bucket. Walter was shoring the new section of the east wall when he heard the rain begin. Not heard exactly, but felt as a vibration more than a sound, a low, irregular drumming on the earth 4 feet above his head, muffled by the clay, into something felt in the sternum rather than heard by the ears. He finished the timber brace he was setting, checking the angle twice. The way Nels had taught him, the angle was not a matter of preference but of load distribution, and load distribution was not a matter of preference but of whether the wall stood or collapsed and climbed out into a sky that had turned the color of pewter overnight. The chamber was 16 feet long now. The ventilation shaft at the far end was dug and capped with the wooden cover he had built from scraps of timber, a simple construction, but a precise one designed to shed rain in any direction, while leaving the circular gap that allowed the air column to move. The tunnel entrance was properly framed with shored and mortised timber. The floor ran at slight slope toward the drain channel at the far end with the consistency of a craftsman's work. Walter stood in the first cold rain of autumn and looked at what he had built and allowed himself briefly the satisfaction of a man who has solved a difficult problem during a difficult season without being destroyed by the difficulty. Then he covered the tunnel entrance with the heavy board and walked to the cabin and changed his wet shirt and went to find wood to fill the chamber with. The mathematics of 30 chords were in their own way an engineering problem rather than a financial one. He could cut and split 7, maybe 8 cords himself from the timber he had dropped in the south field, in the spring trees that had been lying since April in the summer heat, losing their moisture, without his assistance drying in the warm Iowa months, the way cut timber dries when it is left on the ground in a dry season. They were not fully seasoned in the way a careful man seasons wood a year or 2 above ground before burning, but they were far better than green wood, and considerably better than the wood his neighbors would be burning in February after it had sat in rain and snow and ice for 3 months. He spent the first 2 weeks of October working that pile. The axe rose and fell in the cold morning air, his breath coming in short clouds, his shoulders burning with the particular burn of repetitive work that goes on longer than the body would choose. His knees reminded him at the end of each day that 62 was not 42. He ignored them the way he had learned to ignore them, which was not by pretending they were not there, but by deciding that what they were saying was less important than what the work required. 7 cords from his own timber dragged down the tunnel on the wide sledge he had built for exactly this purpose, and stacked in the first section of the chamber in rows that rose to chest height and smelled of cut wood and dry clay. The rest he would have to find. He made a deal with Thomas Aldrich, whose farm sat 2 miles west and whose wife had died the previous spring, leaving him with a corn harvest and not enough hands to bring it in. Aldrich needed his corn brought in and could not pay for labor in cash. Walter worked 3 days at the Aldrich harvest. Long, cold, heavy days of lifting and loading, the kind of work that asks a 62-year-old body questions it is not entirely prepared to answer by the 3rd day, and came home with a promise of 8 cords of already cut wood waiting to be hauled. He spent 2 days hauling it on the wagon, 2 more days moving it underground. 8 cords added to the rows. He made a similar arrangement with a widow named Goss on the county road, 2 days of fence repair in exchange for 4 cords from her back woodlot, split and stacked and ready. The fence needed doing, and she could not do it, and he could, and the exchange was of equal value to both parties, which is the only kind of exchange that holds. Then there was the money question. 10 cords still unaccounted for, and no more labor trades available in the weeks remaining before the first snow. At $4 a cord, $40. Walter had $31 in the tin box Eleanor had kept on the top shelf of the kitchen cabinet, what she had always called the winter account, in a tone that made it clear this was not a metaphor, but a specific designation. It had never before contained less than $60 at this point in the year. Eleanor had seen to that. The difference, $9, was sitting in a seed merchant's ledger in town as a deposit on spring planting stock. Walter rode to town on a Thursday and explained his situation to the merchant with the directness of a man who has no patience for the oblique approach when the direct one will do. The merchant gave back the deposit without significant argument, though he looked at Walter with a particular expression that Walter had learned to recognize as the county's current assessment of his situation. Sympathetic in tone, certain in its conclusion, already composing the version of events it would tell at the general store. Let him tell it. The spring seeds could wait. The winter could not. $40. 10 cords of cut hardwood from a timber operation on the north side of the county, delivered by sledge to the edge of his property on a Tuesday in mid-October, the drivers helping him unload without being asked because they were decent men, and the weight was considerable. Walter spent the rest of that week moving it underground, 1 sledge load at a time, stacking it in the chamber with the methodical care of a man who has learned that how wood is stacked determines how air moves through it, and how air moves through it determines whether it burns clean and long or smokes and hisses and gives half the heat it owes. By the 28th of October, the chamber held 27 cords, 5 short of his number. He found the last 5 cords in the forest on his own south boundary. Deadfall mostly. Dry branches and fallen hardwood limbs that had been lying long enough to lose their surface moisture, the kind of wood that burns fast and hot and is generally overlooked by men doing serious winter preparation because its lightness makes it feel insubstantial next to the solid density of split oak. But Nels had been clear on this, and Nels had been right about everything else. The difference between wood that burns well and wood that burns poorly is not size or weight, but moisture content, and dry deadfall burns clean and produces genuine heat and fills the gap between almost enough and enough. He spent 3 days in the timber with the sledge dragging branches and limbs and sections of fallen trunk back to the property, cutting what needed cutting, splitting what needed splitting, hauling it underground, and stacking it at the far end of the chamber nearest the ventilation shaft where the airflow drew strongest. It was the least elegant part of the collection, and it would burn faster than the split oak, but it would really burn with real heat rather than smoke and steam, and that was what mattered when February arrived with his particular opinions about human endurance. November 1st, 1854. 32 cords of wood in the underground chamber stacked in rows that reached from knee height to within 2 feet of the ceiling in the densest sections. The chamber sealed now with the heavy door he had built from 3-inch planks fitted tight to the timber frame of the entrance, its seam packed with twisted straw to keep the cold air from flowing in under the door and the warm, dry air from flowing out past it. The ventilation shaft turned slowly above, drawing its invisible thread of air through the chamber from entrance to exit, keeping everything at the same moisture level it had arrived at. From outside the cabin, there was nothing to see. No woodpile, no stacked logs, no splitting rounds on the block, no fresh chips of oak on the ground, no indication to anyone who walked past or rode past or stood at the edge of the property and looked carefully that the man inside had any fuel at all. Just a door in the earth fitted so flush to the ground that a man on horseback riding past at a comfortable distance could look at the Crane property for a year and never know it was there. Walter stood at the sealed entrance on the morning of November 1st and pressed his hand flat against the door. Through 3 inches of pine board, the surface was cool and solid and gave nothing away. What was on the other side, what he had built from Eleanor's beginning and Nels's knowledge, in his own 2 months of work, was dry and waiting and entirely invisible to anyone who had not built it themselves. He went inside and put coffee on the stove and sat down for the first time in months without a specific next thing that had to be done before the season changed. Raymond Voss rode past that afternoon right on schedule and saw exactly what he had been expecting to see since July. Nothing. He smiled his careful smile and rode on toward town, adding another week's observation to his calculation. No woodpile in November meant no wood in February. He had seen it 11 times. He would see it a 12th. Voss came to the door in the 3rd week of November. Walter heard the horse first, the particular deliberate quality of hoofbeats, slowing at the property line, and then stopping, not the abrupt stop of a man who has pulled up in surprise, but the controlled stop of a man arriving where he intended to arrive at the moment he intended to arrive there. He was at the kitchen table with his accounts when the knock came. 3 raps precise and evenly spaced, the knock of a man who believes every door he approaches is a door he belongs on the other side of. He opened it. Raymond Voss stood on the porch in a good coat and a better hat, his silver hair visible at the temples, his expression arranged with the practiced care of a man who has learned that expression is a form of argument. He looked like a man paying a social call. He had the eyes of a man closing a transaction. "Walt," he said, informal, familiar, the word carrying the weight of an assumption that they were on terms that permitted informality, that the informality was mutual, that the easy use of the first name was a reflection of relationship rather than a statement of the relationship Voss intended to establish. "You are," Walter said, "but come in if you are going to." Voss came in. He looked around the kitchen with the quick inventory of a man who prices things automatically the way other men read, the way musicians listen to rooms for acoustics. He accepted the chair Walter gestured to. He declined the coffee, then changed his mind and accepted it, which Walter recognized as a tactic accepting hospitality, creating the sensation of mutual exchange, making the person across the table feel that something balanced was happening when what was happening was entirely one-directional. "I'll be direct," Voss said. He said this with the conviction of a man who has decided that the direct approach is the best approach for this particular target, which is itself not the direct approach, but a calculated version of it. "I've been watching your property since August. You have no wood stacked. It's November. I've been in this county long enough to know what that means, and I think you're man enough to appreciate frankness over dancing around the subject." "I imagine you have," Walter said. "I want to help." The word help in Voss's mouth had the quality of a tool that had been used many times for purposes other than the one printed on its label, still functional in the technical sense, but worn in a way that showed the alternative uses. $500 for the 80 acres. That is more than the land's current market value, and you know it. You go to Cincinnati. Your son, I hear he's a good man, has established himself well. He has a house, a life, a place for his father. You don't have to spend the next 4 months trying to survive a winter alone at your age." Walter looked at him across the kitchen table. He thought about the letter, the $300 offer made to a sick woman in private before she was cold. The price had risen apparently now that Voss was negotiating with the man directly. Perhaps he had decided the property was worth more than he had told Eleanor. Or perhaps he had learned in the weeks since that letter that Walter Crane was not going to be as easy as the letter's recipient had appeared to be. "No," Walter said. Voss nodded slowly with the patience of a man who had heard this answer many times and understood it as the beginning of a negotiation rather than the end of one. 800. Still no. $1,000, Walt. Voss set his coffee cup down with deliberate precision, the gesture of a man who wants his next words to land in the silence the gesture creates. That is more than this land is worth at current prices. More than you paid for it. More than you would see from 10 years of farming it alone at your age, with no partner, with debt you cannot service without two people working. He leaned forward slightly, not with aggression, but with the particular forward weight of a man who is accustomed to being the gravitational center of every negotiation he enters. I'm trying to be fair with you before circumstances make fairness harder to arrange. Walter stood up and carried his coffee cup to the counter. He stood with his back to Voss for a long moment, looking out the south-facing window Eleanor had chosen for reasons he had eventually come to understand. The November light moved across the floor in exactly the way she had said it would. He turned around. I'm not selling, he said. Not for 1,000, not for 5,000, not in January when the temperature drops, and you're hoping I'll reconsider not in February when you send someone by to check whether I've frozen yet. He picked up Voss's coffee cup from the table and carried it to the counter as well. It was an unmistakable gesture. You can go now. Voss looked at him for a long moment. Something behind his expression made a small movement, like a tide pulling back to assess the shoreline before deciding whether to come in harder or recede entirely. He stood. He buttoned his coat with the care of a man who is keeping his hands occupied while his mind processes an outcome it had not fully prepared for. He put on his hat. I'll check in on you in January, he said at the door, as a neighbor. Don't trouble yourself, Walter said. He closed the door. He stood at the counter and listened to the horse leave the hoofbeats moving up the road with less deliberateness than they had arrived with, and felt something that was not triumph. Triumph required an ending, and this was not yet an ending, but was in the general direction of solid ground. The thing Harold Finch told him arrived the way important information often arrives, embedded in the middle of a conversation about something else said almost as an aside landing, with a weight that the speaker may not have fully anticipated. It was a Saturday in late November, ice thick enough on the morning puddles that it did not soften by noon, and Finch had come by with a haunch of venison from his fall hunt. It was the kind of gesture that Walter accepted without ceremony, because refusing it would have been an insult to the friendship that underpinned it, and because venison in November was genuinely useful. They sat on the porch in their coats and drank coffee while the November sky did what November skies in Iowa do, pressed itself down toward the earth with patient, purposeful intent. Finch was talking about the county assessor's new round of property evaluations, which was causing the kind of general irritation that property tax discussions reliably produce, when he said something that made Walter set down his coffee cup. Voss has been working with Alderman Greer on new assessment rates, Finch said. Higher rates for what they're calling unproductive parcels, land that isn't showing active cultivation or commercial timber operation. It passed in a closed session last month. Takes effect in January. Walter was quiet. I didn't connect it to your situation until after you mentioned Voss coming by, Finch continued. But some of the farmers at the store have been saying, and I'm not certain of this, that Voss helped draft the language of the assessment criteria. That it was written to apply specifically to properties held by people living off the land alone, widowers and widows without active farm operations. He paused, hearing the full weight of what he was saying. Walt. How much higher? Walter said. Double the standard rate on properties below the productivity threshold. Walter calculated with the cold efficiency he had been applying to his situation since July. He had known the mathematics of survival for months. He had accounted for the wood. He had accounted for the seed deposit spent. He had accounted for the horses and the feed and the tools that would need replacing and the taxes at the standard rate. He had not accounted for his taxes doubling in January because Raymond Voss had apparently decided that watching the clock run out was too slow and had built a mechanism to make the clock run faster. He had to acknowledge elegant in the way that genuinely ruthless things are sometimes elegant. No threats, no confrontations, no visible malice that anyone could point to directly. Just a policy change written in the dry, neutral language of county administration that technically applied to everyone but was aimed with precision at specific people, the kind of people who showed up in county ledgers as problems waiting to resolve themselves, and in Raymond Voss's ledger as acquisitions waiting to happen. Voss had not just been waiting, he had been engineering the wait to end on his preferred schedule. Who else does it affect? Walter asked. Finch named 4 properties. Walter knew them all of them farms where Voss had been making offers in the past 2 years. All of them held by people in their 60s alone, working land that required more than one person to work efficiently in the position that Voss's entire business model depended on, capable of surviving without help but not indefinitely, and made less capable with each added pressure. He sat with this for a moment. Not with anger. Anger was not useful here, but with the focus of a man recalculating a problem he had thought he understood and now understands differently. I appreciate you telling me, he said. Finch looked at him for a moment. What are you going to do? What I've been doing, Walter said. Work. Finch left an hour later. Walter sat alone on the porch after he was gone in the cold that had deepened since morning and thought about January. He had the wood. He had solved the heat problem. But heat was not the only thing a man needed to survive a winter, and Voss had apparently understood this better than Walter had when he had made his single decision in July and believed that was sufficient. He went inside and counted the tin box. He pulled out the accounts he had kept since August. Every trade, every purchase, every cord of wood accounted for every dollar, tracked with the exactness of a man who knows that imprecision in accounting is the beginning of imprecision in survival. He spent an hour with the numbers, working through every scenario he could construct. At the end of the hour, he had an answer. He could cover the doubled taxes. Barely. The margin was real, but it was thin, the kind of thin that required nothing else to go wrong for the entire winter. No equipment failure that required cash to fix. No horse illness. No unexpected expense of any kind. The margin between solvency and the situation Voss was engineering was so narrow it was almost invisible. But almost invisible was different from invisible. Almost impossible was different from impossible. The margin existed. It was enough. He would make it enough. December came in hard, the way Iowa Decembers announce themselves when they intend to make a point about what winter means in this particular geography. The first real snow fell on the 6th 8 inches overnight, and the temperature that arrived behind the snow system was the kind of cold that Iowans describe to each other with the grim pride of people who have chosen to live in a place that tests them regularly. Ice on the inside of the cabin window panes by morning, not frost patterns, but actual ice opaque along the edges, telling a man something specific about the night's lowest temperature. The pump in the yard required careful attention to operate without freezing the mechanism. The horses in the paddock needed extra feed to maintain their body temperature against the cold, which was an expense Walter had planned for, but which arrived with fresh weight every morning when he measured the grain. He began burning from the underground chamber with the measured care of a man who has exactly enough of something and intends to make exactly enough last exactly as long as it needs to. One sledge load of split oak per morning hauled up the tunnel and stacked beside the cabin door. Enough to run the stove through the day at a full heat and bank enough coals to keep the cabin above freezing overnight, to keep the pipes from hardening, to keep the horses' water from solidifying in the bucket. The wood was exactly what Nels had described in July when it had been theory rather than experience. Dry as kindling, burning clean and slow and long, throwing off a steady radiance that a man could feel from across the room and rely on through the night rather than the frantic initial heat of wet wood that burns itself out in an hour and leaves ash and smoke and the cold coming back through the walls. The cabin was warm. Not the warmth of a man who has more than he needs. Walter was not burning extravagantly, was not heating rooms. He was not using or running the stove at unnecessary intensity, but genuinely, sustainably warm in the way that matters. A man wakes up in the morning and can go directly to work rather than spending the first 2 hours trying to get his temperature to functional. He had 32 cords in November. He was burning at a careful rate. Harold Finch came by on a Thursday in the second week of December, ostensibly to return a tool he had borrowed in October. He was wearing more layers than the half-mile walk from his property should have required, and his color was the color of a man who has been cold for too long and whose body is no longer keeping up with the demand. He drank the coffee Walter put in front of him and talked about county business and his son in Missouri, and a fence dispute 2 farms north, and when he finally stood to leave, he paused at the door with the pause of a man about to say something he has been working up to saying. Our stack is lower than it should be at this point in the season, he said. Not a request, just a statement. the way men of that era said things they needed to say without the dignity of asking directly. Walter went to the tunnel entrance, opened the door, went down, loaded the sledge with a cord of split oak, and hauled it up. He helped Finch load it onto his horse without commentary on where it had come from. Finch stood at the property line looking back at him. "You have enough for yourself." "I have enough," Walter said. He said it without elaboration. Elaboration would have required a conversation he was not ready to have, and the conversation could wait. What could not wait was Finch's fire. 2 days later, he gave wood to the family on the county road, 3 children under 10, a father with a shoulder injury that had kept him from cutting adequate wood before the season. A week after that, 2 cords to Aldrich, who had given him 8 cords in October and had since burned through them faster than a good winter should have required because the wood had been stored outside and had taken on moisture during November's rains and was now burning at half its caloric value. By Christmas, Walter had given away 6 cords and still had 23 in the chamber. He did not discuss this with anyone. There was no woodpile to see. There was just a man in a warm cabin with a door in the earth and the quiet arithmetic of preparation done thoroughly enough to allow generosity without danger. The second week of January, the temperature dropped to 30 below. It stayed there for 9 days without interruption. The kind of cold that does not feel like weather, but like a decision, a statement from the climate about what it thinks of human settlement in this latitude. Snow compacted under its own weight to a glassy hardness. Fence posts groaned audibly in the night as the wood contracted. The creek froze not just at the surface, but to the bottom in the shallow sections. The sky went a flat, airless blue that Iowans who had lived through severe cold knew as the signature color of a cold that had not reached its worst yet. The county burned through its wood reserves at twice the standard rate. Wet wood in extreme cold is not merely inefficient, it is almost useless. It requires enormous amounts of heat energy just to drive the moisture out of its cells before it will sustain combustion. It produces a dense gray eye-watering smoke that coats flue pipes with creosote in days rather than weeks, and forces men outside in 30 below temperatures to clear chimneys that have clogged in the night. The heat it eventually gives is hard-won and short-lived. Walter heard the reports at the feed store, families burning furniture, men cutting green timber in the deep cold, dragging it inside still green and wet, burning it wet because there was nothing else. The wood suppliers who had sold out in November were charging triple for whatever seasoned wood remained, and there was almost none remaining. George Pratt found Walter at the feed store door on a gray January afternoon. He was 61 years old, a compact man with the careful manner of someone who has learned to move carefully in spaces controlled by others. He had farmed the county road property for 15 years before Raymond Voss had made the mathematics of continuing to do so unsustainable a sequence of dry summers, a bad equipment loan, and an assessment increase that had arrived on precisely the schedule that Voss's method required. He had sold for less than the land was worth because the alternative at the time had been worse. He worked for Voss now, hauling maintenance, the kind of labor a capable man takes when he has used up his other options. He was not a man who enjoyed his current situation. He was a man enduring it while looking for what came next. He stopped Walter at the feed store door and spoke with his hat in his hands and his voice below the ambient noise of the store. "I want to tell you something," Pratt said. "About Voss." Walter waited. The wood he took delivery on this fall, 12 cords, came in the second week of September from a supplier up north. It was good wood when it arrived, dry, solid oak, exactly what it was supposed to be. Pratt glanced toward the store interior, then back to Walter. He had them stack it behind the east barn. Outside, no cover, because he said he didn't have time to deal with a storage arrangement that week. He'd deal with it later. Pratt paused. He never dealt with it. It sat through October and November, through the November rains, through the ice in December. He looked at Walter steadily. "He's been burning it for a month. I've been moving it for him. More than half of what he has left is wet through to the center." Walter was quiet. He looked at Pratt without expression. "He's going to run short by February," Pratt said. "Maybe before February. And when he does, he's going to need to buy, and there's nothing affordable left in this county to buy." He put his hat back on with the deliberate care of a man completing a transaction. "I don't entirely know why I'm telling you this. I suppose because he's spent 20 years watching people fail from a comfortable distance and showing up at the right moment to collect what the failure left behind. I thought it might be worth his knowing that this winter he's going to find out what that feels like from the other position. He nodded once and went back into the store. Walter stood in the cold January air for a moment, his breath rising and dispersing, thinking about Voss writing the assessment language in the fall before Eleanor died, thinking about the letter in the sewing basket, thinking about 11 farms and 11 families and the pattern of patience and acquisition that Pratt had been a part of and was now apparently no longer comfortable being a part of. He went back to his horse, loaded his supplies, and rode home through the cold afternoon with the particular quiet of a man who has just received information he doesn't need but is glad to have. That evening, he went underground and walked the chamber with the lamp, checking the wall junctions for moisture, testing the ventilation with a candle flame, pressing his hand against the timber framing. Everything exactly as it had been in November. 23 cords, dry and solid, smelling of wood and earth and the slow work of summer. He stood in the chamber at the end of January and held the lamp up and looked at the rows of wood that nobody knew he had. Raymond Voss was riding past his property every week and seeing nothing, was calculating nothing plus February's particular cruelty, and arriving at the answer. He had always arrived at the answer that had been right in 11 times. What he did not know, what no one in the county knew yet, was that the man he was waiting on was standing in the warmest room in the county, surrounded by more dry wood than most farms in this county had seen since October. Walter lowered the lamp. He climbed back up the tunnel into the cold January night and sealed the door behind him. The stove threw its steady heat. The coffee was still warm on the back burner. February was coming. Let it come. February arrived without apology. The first week brought temperatures that made January feel like a prelude. Not cold with wind or drama. That kind of cold announces itself, gives a man time to prepare his response. This was the other kind, the kind that simply descended over the county like a settled weight and did not move. It pressed down on rooftops and frozen fields and the shoulders of men who had been fighting it since December and were running out of the particular energy that fighting cold requires. The creek was frozen solid enough to drive a wagon across without concern. The sky was the color of iron, day after day, flat and indifferent. At the general store, the conversations had passed through all their earlier registers. Preparation in October, caution, in November, concern in December, and arrived now at their final form. Survival in the plain and unembellished sense of the word. Who had wood? Who didn't? Who had borrowed from a neighbor and not repaid it and was going to have to ask again? Who was burning fence posts? Who had sent children to relatives in town because the farmhouse could not be kept warm enough for small bodies with what remained? Walter heard all of it when he rode in for supplies. He listened and said very little, which was his habit in all seasons, and served him particularly well in this one. He bought what he needed and rode back through the cold with his collar up. His cabin was warm. He had 19 cords left in the chamber at the beginning of February. At current burn rate, he had enough to run past March without stress. He had been generous with his neighbors in December, and January 6 cords gone to other households, and still had 19 cords. The preparation had been thorough enough to allow generosity without danger. Voss sent 2 men on a Tuesday in the second week of February. Walter saw them coming from the kitchen window, 2 figures on horseback, moving up the road at the unhurried pace of men who have been sent rather than men with a genuine destination. He recognized one of them, Calhoun, who did periodic work for various landowners around the county. The other he did not know. He opened the door before they reached the porch. They pulled their horses up and looked at him with expressions that had been calibrated for a different scene. A man in difficulty has a particular appearance that becomes readable with familiarity, and they had expected to read it here. What they saw instead was a man standing in a warm doorway, with visible warmth behind him, wearing work clothes apparently interrupted from a morning he had not been struggling through. "Mr. Crane," Calhoun said, his breath heavy in the cold. "Mr. Voss asked us to come by. He wanted to be sure you were that everything was all right." "Everything is fine," Walter said. Calhoun looked past him into the interior. He looked at the thin, even line of smoke rising from the chimney, the signature of a clean, hot, well-fed fire, not the dense gray column of wet wood laboring to burn. He looked at the yard, the same yard he had presumably ridden past before. No woodpile, no logs, no visible fuel of any kind. "Mr. Voss is concerned about your fuel situation," the second man said in the manner of someone who has been given language and is using it as given. given the temperatures we've been having. My fuel situation is fine, Walter said. The two men exchanged a look of people whose script has been interrupted at its first line. He wanted to let you know, Calhoun said carefully, that he'd be willing to revisit his earlier offer, in light of current conditions. Walter looked at them for a moment. He looked at the cold behind them, the white fields, the flat iron sky. He looked at the horses shifting weight in the cold. Come down, he said. They looked at each other. Off the horses, Walter said. Leave them at the post. There's something you can take back and tell him. He led them around the north side of the cabin without explanation. The north side was in shadow, the snow undisturbed except for a single line of boot prints, his own from the morning's wood collection leading to a flat section of ground that appeared from any distance to be simply a flat section of ground. He reached down and lifted the door. The tunnel opened in the cabin's north shadow 3 feet wide, framed in heavy timber, mortised and braced with the care of something built to last decades, sloping down and away from the surface at the angle that Nels Bjorn had specified for drainage and access. The air that moved outward from the opening was not warm, but was distinctly not as cold as the air above the equalized temperature of a space insulated by earth on all sides, held at a constant by the ground that surrounded it. Walter picked up the lantern hung inside the entrance and lit it. Follow me, he said. He went down first. He heard them hesitate at the entrance, with the hesitation specific to men asked to descend underground behind someone they don't know well. And then he heard their boots on the stone-lined tunnel floor, and they came. The tunnel ran 20 feet. At its far end, it opened into the chamber. Walter held the lantern up. The wood was stacked in rows that began at shoulder height on the left wall and rose to within 2 feet of the ceiling on the right where he had managed the densest packing. Oak through most of the main section, with the birch and deadfall visible at the far end nearest the ventilation shaft. The rows were straight and even built with the same care he had given the chamber walls because improperly stacked wood shifts and collapses, and collapsed wood waste space, and wasted space in a storage chamber, is a kind of carelessness he had not permitted himself. The wood was dry. A man who had handled firewood for any significant period could read it immediately, the color of wood that has not absorbed moisture, the way it sat without the swelling and surface checking, that wet wood develops the smell of wood rather than the smell of wet wood, which are different smells entirely. No snow on it, no ice, no moisture of any kind. Calhoun had stopped 3 feet into the chamber and was standing still. The younger man behind him had not yet come far enough in to see the full extent of it. Walter walked the length of the chamber, slowly holding the lantern at varying heights, letting the light move across the rows the way light moves across a landscape when you want someone to grasp its scale. 19 cords, he said. That is what remains. I had 32 in November. 13 cords burned between the first snow and today. He stopped at the far wall and held the lantern up toward the ventilation shaft, a narrow column of gray winter light falling from the surface above the air, moving visibly as a slight shimmer in the lamp's light. Air enters through the tunnel, moves across the wood, exits through that shaft. The wood remains at the same moisture level it arrived at. It does not change from season to season. He turned and looked at them. Calhoun was a man of practical experience and genuine intelligence, and his expression was not the expression of a man confronting something impossible, but the specific expression of someone encountering something straightforward that he has simply never seen before and is now accommodating into his understanding of what is possible. How long did this take to build? Calhoun said. August and September for the digging. October to collect the wood. You did this alone. I had help at the start, then alone. The younger man had come far enough in to see the full extent of the storage now. The official manner had left him entirely. He was simply looking at something he had not expected to find and was trying to take the full measure of it. Mr. Voss wanted to know, Calhoun said, where your wood was coming from. Now you can tell him, Walter said. He led them back through the tunnel. Outside in the cold gray February morning, they stood for a moment while Walter closed and latched the door. Calhoun said they'd relay the information. He said he appreciated Walter's time. He mounted his horse with the efficiency of a man who wants to be away from a place before it asks anything further of him. They rode back up the road toward the county track and did not look back. Walter watched them go. He went inside and poured a second cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the window his wife had chosen for the way the winter light moved through it. The news moved through the county the way news moves in rural places, not through any single source, not through any planned announcement, but through the accumulated weight of multiple people saying related things to each other over the course of several days until the full shape of it became visible to everyone. By the end of that week, most of the county knew that Walter Crane had 30-odd cords of dry wood stored underground, had built the storage himself over the summer, and had spent the winter that was destroying his neighbor's reserves sitting on enough fuel to run 2 full winters without running short. Harold Finch came by on a Saturday morning, unusual for him, Saturdays being reserved for his own farm's needs, and stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hands, looking like a man who is recalibrating a significant number of his assumptions simultaneously. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. "Nothing to tell," Walter said. "I was solving a problem. I spent 3 months worrying about you." "I know you did. I appreciated the fact of it." Finch looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man who has been proved wrong in a direction that doesn't make him angry so much as it makes him something more complicated. "You're the most aggravating man in this county," he said. The delivery was not angry. It was the delivery of a man stating a fact he has recently confirmed. He stayed 2 hours. They talked about the assessment increase, which Walter had survived by the thinnest calculable margin, and about the conversations now happening at the general store. Finch had heard from 3 separate sources that the assessment language had been written at Voss's direction, which was being discussed now in considerably more direct language than it had been in October when it was still speculative. "People are talking differently about him," Finch said. "It's not just the wood. The wood made something visible that was always there, but that people had been reading as bad luck, as circumstances, as the way things work. Now they're reading it as what it actually was." He finished his coffee. "Pratt has been talking about the assessment, about the farms Voss bought over the years and what the sequence looked like from inside it." "Pratt is a decent man," Walter said. "He's a man with something to say," Finch said, "which is sometimes the same thing." Raymond Voss came himself on a Wednesday. The temperature had moderated from its January extremes in Iowa. In February, this means it was still below zero, but no longer felt like an active assault on the body's ability to maintain itself. Voss rode up alone, which Walter noted. He had come alone in November as well, but in November the solitude had been the solitude of a man operating in his own territory. Today the solitude was different in quality, the solitude of a man who has decided to face something directly because sending others has produced information he needs to confront himself. Walter was splitting wood in the yard when he arrived. Not because he needed the wood, the chamber was providing everything required, but because a man of 62 who spends an entire winter being sedentary will not be a man of 62 come spring. The axe rose and fell with the regularity of maintained habit. He heard the horse and kept working until Voss was at the property line, then set the axe head on the block and waited. Voss dismounted. He tied his horse at the road post. He walked across the yard in the cold with his hands in his coat pockets and stopped 10 feet from Walter and looked at him. He looked different from every previous encounter. Not diminished physically, he was still a tall, upright man who carried himself with the posture of someone accustomed to occupying space. But something was missing from beneath the surface of his expression that had been there in November and October in every exchange they had had. A bedrock certainty. The quiet conviction of a man who knows the territory he is operating in and knows his position within it. That certainty was gone. "I want to see it," Voss said. "See what Walter said. The storage. The underground chamber." He said it without the arrangement of affect that had characterized every previous sentence he had addressed to Walter. He said it plainly, as a man states a plain desire. Walter looked at him for a moment. A man who had written a legal mechanism to accelerate the failure of properties he wanted to acquire. A man who had made an offer to Walter's dying wife by private letter, counting on privacy and exhaustion and love to do what he could not do directly. A man who had spent 20 years turning other people's worst moments into his best transactions. "All right," Walter said. He led Voss around to the north side of the cabin. He lifted the door. He lit the lantern. He went down the tunnel. In the chamber, Walter held the lantern and stood back and said nothing. He let Voss see. What happened to Voss in that space was not visible on the surface of him. He was a man whose face had been trained for 40 years to reveal nothing inconvenient. But it was legible in other ways. In how he moved, in the particular slowness of a man who is not inspecting something, but encountering it. He walked the length of the chamber with his hands at his sides, not touching the wood, not testing the walls. He stopped at the ventilation shaft and looked up at the pale column of winter sky visible at its top. He stood in the center of the space and was still for a long moment. He was not calculating the wood's value. He was not assessing the property's worth or revising his offer upward. He was doing something Walter recognized because he had done it himself in this same chamber. On a night in January with a lantern in his hand, he was understanding something he had not understood before. In working out what the understanding meant. Here was a man who had built his entire method on the certainty that people under sufficient pressure would choose relief over persistence. Who had been right about this 11 times in 20 years? Who had identified Walter Crane as the 12th application of a formula that had never failed? And who was now standing in the proof that the formula had failed? Not because Walter was exceptional, not because of luck or unusual circumstance, because a man had dug a hole in the summer while no one was watching and filled it with wood and sealed the door, and the method that required visible desperation had encountered invisible preparation and found it had nothing to work with. "You built this alone," Voss said, not a question. A statement from a man completing an accurate accounting. "Started with help, finished alone. In the summer, while I rode past your property every week and saw nothing." He said it without inflection. The tone of a man reviewing a sequence of events and locating where his reading of them went wrong. "Yes," Walter said. They stood in the chamber with the lamp between them and the rows of dry wood on all sides, and the thin column of February light coming down from the ventilation shaft above, and Voss was quiet for a long time. $1,500, Voss said at last. He said it without the weight he had put behind every previous offer, without the tone of a man delivering the terms that will close the negotiation. He said it as a number he was uncertain was the right number, which was something Walter had never heard from him before. "No," Walter said. "It's the most I've offered for a property this size. In 20 years. "I know what it is," Walter said. "And I know what this land is worth. And I know what I've built on it." He walked to the tunnel entrance. "You can go now." Voss looked at him. He looked at the rows of wood. He looked at the man standing at the tunnel entrance with the lantern, 62 years old, not moving toward Cincinnati or anywhere else. He walked to the tunnel and went up. Walter followed, sealed the door, and walked him to his horse without speaking. At the property line there, Voss put his hand on the saddle and paused. "I misjudged you," he said. Not an apology. Voss was not a man who apologized. A statement of fact from a man who considered accurate accounting important even when it cost him something. "You misjudged Eleanor," Walter said. Voss looked at him. Walter held his eyes. "She started the hole," Walter said. "She found Nels Bjorn in the spring and asked him the right questions, and then went out in the early mornings and started digging before she told me anything about it. The letter you wrote her, the one she kept in the sewing basket, she didn't sign it. She didn't tell me about it. She just kept digging the hole in the dark mornings when I was in the field." He looked at Voss steadily without heat, with the particular clarity of a man saying a thing that is entirely true and does not require emotion to make it true. "You were counting on the wrong person's failure from the beginning. You always were." Voss was quiet for a long moment. His horse shifted weight in the cold. The gray February sky sat on everything with its flat, impartial weight. He mounted. He rode up the county road toward town without looking back. Walter watched him go until the gray mare was a small shape in the gray distance, and then he turned back to the splitting block and picked up his axe. He had wood enough, but a man still split what needed splitting. Nels Bjorn died in June of 1855. It came without great drama, which was appropriate for a man who had lived without great drama in the sense that drama requires performance, and Nels Bjorn had never performed anything in his life. He had been declining through the spring in the way that old men who have worked very hard for very long sometimes decline, not collapsing, not surrendering, but gradually withdrawing from the outer reaches of what had been possible toward a smaller and quieter center. His son had come from Minnesota in April and had been at the property since managing the farm with the competence of a man who had learned farming from an exacting teacher. Walter visited twice a week through May. He did not ask questions he already knew the answers to. He did not bring food that wasn't needed. He came and sat and talked when Nels wanted to talk, which was sometimes, and sat in useful quiet when Nels did not, which was more often. On the last visit, Nels was in the chair by the window that faced north across his fields toward the county road. He was wearing his good shirt, not a Sunday shirt. Nels Bjorn had never worn a Sunday shirt in his life, but the shirt he reserved for occasions that required it, and Walter understood the wearing of it as a form of information. His hands were on his knees, the oversized hands, the enlarged knuckles, the hands that had helped frame the chamber walls and tested the timber shoring and drawn the ventilation dimensions in the Iowa dirt with a stick. He knew Walter was there without turning. "Wood holds," he said. 12-13 cords left, Walter said. "More than enough to begin next season's storage before this one is fully depleted." Nels nodded slowly and once. "You'll show others," he said. It was not a question and it was not a request. It was a statement of something he had decided was true and needed to say aloud. "Already started," Walter said. "Finch is digging. The family on the county road, the one with the 3 children. 2 other properties. Finch says there will be more next season." Nels was quiet for a time. Outside the north window, the June fields stood in the full green of their best weeks. The corn already knee-high, everything as far as possible from the color and weight of February. The light was long and warm and had in it the particular generosity of early summer that makes a man want to stay in it. "My father taught me," Nels said. His voice had the quality of something retrieved from a long distance, not confused, not diminished, but following a thread back through time to a specific place. "After the winter of 1820, after the boys." He paused. "He said wood in the ground never forgets it was supposed to be dry. It holds what it was." Walter sat with that for a moment. "He was right," Walter said. "He was usually right. When there was a sound that might have been a laugh. Brief low. The sound of a man who is past the point of laughing fully, but not past the point of finding something worth a small sound. About wood anyway." The afternoon light moved through the window and lay across the floor and moved on as the sun shifted. Outside, the Norwegian farmer's fields stood in their June abundance, 30 years of his labor visible in every row. The hands on his knees were still. Walter sat beside him. When Nels Bjorn died near evening with the last of the long June light coming level and gold through the north window across the fields he had built from nothing, Walter was holding his hand, the hand that had tested timber shoring and pressed flat against stacked dry wood and knotted and drawn dimensions in the dirt and shaken Walter's hand at Eleanor's funeral with both of his, because he had known even then that the grip of both hands said more than the grip of one. Walter drove home in the dark. He sat at Eleanor's kitchen table. He looked at the south window, dark now, reflecting the lamp's light back at him. He cried for the first time since the burial nearly a year before, and it was for all of them at once, Eleanor Nels, the 2 small boys in the Norwegian winter of 1820, who had never known the men their deaths eventually made possible. He sat at the table and let the grief run its course, which is the only thing grief permits. And when it was done, he put water on the stove and made coffee and sat in the warm kitchen until the dark outside shifted toward the early gray of a summer morning. By the harvest of 1855, 4 farms in the county had underground wood storage. By 1856-9, Walter spent time at each one as he could, walking the dimensions, with the man who was building answering the questions he had asked himself in August of the previous year. The ventilation shaft was consistently the piece people wanted to omit, too much work for a feature no one would ever see. He explained each time in the plain language Nels had used with him what happened to wood stored without moving air. He used the phrase Nels had given him, the difference between a wood storage and a wood grave. Nobody skipped the ventilation shaft. Finch was the first. His chamber was smaller than Walter's 12 cords, right for his household, and he built it through September 1855 with his son's help, finishing 2 weeks before the first snow and standing at the sealed entrance with his hands on his hips and the expression of a man who has done something that will change every winter remaining to him. "I should have listened in September," he said. "You listened when it mattered," Walter said. "I thought you'd lost your mind." "I know you did." Finch looked at the sealed door in the ground and shook his head with the particular motion of a man revising a long-held assessment. "Remarkable," he said. It was for Harold Finch a considerable statement. Raymond Voss did not acquire any more farms in the county after 1855. He did not stop trying. He continued to appear at the general store, continued to ride past properties he had identified, continued to operate with the long horizon patience that had served him for 2 decades. But something had changed in the county's relationship to his method, what Finch had described the system becoming visible, and men who had previously been uncertain about their situations were now less uncertain. Pratt kept talking. The assessment language was reviewed by the county board in the spring of 1856 and revised under pressure from a petition that included Walter's name among the signatures. The legal mechanism Voss had built into the county's administrative structure was dismantled by the same county that had passed it. Voss did not leave the county. He had too much invested to leave. But his ability to convert other people's difficulty into his own acquisition, the particular skill he had honed over 20 years, the method that had never failed, had encountered something it could not convert, and in failing once had lost a quality it never fully recovered. He died in 1871. His estate went to his children who were decent people without their father's talent for the specific kind of patient predation he had practiced. The farms he had accumulated were sold off gradually, divided, worked by other people, and within a decade his name was the kind of name a county remembers but does not repeat. Margaret Hale came to see the underground chamber in October of 1857. She was 57 years old, a widow from the county's eastern side, whose husband had died of a heart failure the previous winter, leaving her a farm she was determined to keep and the practical intelligence to figure out how to keep it. She had heard about Walter's storage from Finch's wife, and she had the direct manner of a woman who moves toward useful information without waiting to be formally introduced to it. Walter showed her the chamber. She walked its length methodically, pressing her hand against the wall framing, looking up at the ventilation shaft, examining the junction between the tunnel floor and the chamber floor, checking the drainage channel. Where Voss had stood in this same space and encountered the fact of his own misjudgment, Margaret Hale was doing something different. She was reading a system, understanding how it worked, calculating how it could be improved. "The drainage channel," she said. "How far does it extend from the tunnel entrance?" 12 feet, into a collection pit at the far end. And in spring thaw, when the ground releases its moisture, the slope moves it to the pit without breaching the chamber floor. 2 winters now without a problem. She nodded, looking at the east wall. "You could extend the chamber here." She placed her hand on the east timber framing. "Run a perpendicular section from this wall. You'd more than double storage without rebuilding the entrance or the ventilation. The airflow geometry supports it." Walter looked at where she was pointing. He had thought about expansion in the abstract, but had not worked through the specific geometry. She was right. The expansion was structurally sound and would add significant capacity without requiring new primary framing or a second ventilation system. "You've built something similar," he said. "Root cellar on my property. Larger than most. Different purpose, same principles." And she turned and looked at him directly. The direct look of a woman who is efficient with time and does not see the purpose of the indirect approach when the direct one is available. "I'd want to understand the full construction sequence before attempting it on my property." "I could walk you through it," Walter said. She looked at him for a moment with an assessment that was careful and unhurried. "You could," she said. She stayed for coffee. She came back the following Saturday with specific questions about timber, shoring angles, and drainage slope calculations. She came back the Saturday after that, and the one after, and at some point the questions migrated from underground construction to the farm itself, the Southfield timber, the horse management, the property line dispute. Walter had been navigating with the County Road Commission for 3 years. They were married in the spring of 1858. Walter Crane was 66 years old. The ceremony was held in the cabin that had been warm through 4 winters, attended by Harold Finch and his wife, and a dozen others from the county. It was a practical occasion carried out by practical people, and it was also beneath the practicality, something that both of them understood as the particular grace of a second life, begun late enough to know what it is. Margaret brought energy and a structural understanding of underground construction that improved the chamber's design in 3 significant ways in the first year. The expansion she had described in October became real the following autumn, a perpendicular section running from the east wall, adding 17 cords of capacity and a second entrance on the cabin's east side. By the winter of 1859, the Crane property could hold 50 cords of dry hardwood in a chamber invisible from any direction on any road. They raised 2 children. They farmed the 80 acres that Eleanor had fought to keep and Walter had fought to keep after her. They never ran short of wood. They never ran short of much. Walter Crane died in October of 1882. He was 90 years old, which was unusual enough to be remarked upon, and which he attributed without particular modesty to the simple fact of staying warm in February when February intended otherwise. He had outlived Eleanor by 28 years. He had outlived Nels by 27. He had outlived Raymond Voss by 11. Margaret survived him by 6 years, continuing to farm and to teach the underground storage method to anyone who asked, which people did regularly until the end of her life. By the time Walter died, the county had 43 properties with underground wood storage. The technique had spread the way. Practical techniques spread in communities of working people through demonstration and imitation and the particular chain of transmission that happens when one person says to another, "Come and look at this, it works. Let me show you how." And most of the people who had built one knew where the county's version of it had started, even if they had learned it from someone who had learned it from someone else. The original chamber was still in use when Walter died. He had maintained it with the attention of a craftsman who understands that maintenance is not optional, but constitutive, replacing timber framing as sections aged, relining the drainage channel when the stone shifted, rebuilding the ventilation shaft cap twice in 30 years when winter weather damaged it. The chamber he and Nels Bjorn had designed in the dirt with a stick built from the hole Eleanor had dug in the early mornings of her last spring had held dry wood through 28 consecutive Iowa winters. He was buried beside Eleanor in the spot near the creek where the wildflowers came in thick in April and May, which was the spot she had chosen before there was any reason to choose it, because she had thought ahead and knew that a good place to be buried should be selected while a person is in a position to have preferences about it. His obituary ran 3 paragraphs in the county paper. It mentioned Margaret. It mentioned the children and grandchildren. It mentioned the long life on the farm and his service on the county assessment board, and his role in the 1856 petition that had revised the property tax language. It did not mention the underground chamber. It did not mention Raymond Voss, or the letter that had burned in the stove, or the November 1st inventory, or the night in October when the rain came through the wall and Walter had sat at the bottom of a flooded hole in the cold dark with his hands bleeding and nearly given up, and then stood up and kept working. It did not mention Nels Bjorn, or the winter of 1820, or the 2 small children in a Norwegian winter, whose deaths had set in motion a chain of knowledge passed from father to son to neighbor that had eventually, in a specific county in Iowa in a specific year, kept a man alive when everyone looking at his empty yard had been certain he would not survive. Obituaries rarely contain the real story. They contain the version of a life that can be stated in 3 paragraphs and printed in a county paper and read at a burial and leave people nodding. The real story takes longer and requires more explanation and does not fit neatly into any standard form. The real story was this. A man of 62 had lost his wife in July and sat on a porch until the stars came out and looked at the numbers of his survival and found them impossible. He had gone through her things 10 days later and found a letter from the man who was waiting for him to fail and a hole in the earth behind his cabin that his dead wife had started digging in the early mornings of her last spring with a sick woman's body and a practical woman's knowledge and the intention of finishing it before she had to explain it. She had not finished it. She had left him the hole and the shovel and the silent instruction written in the stone-lined floor and the careful beginning, "Keep going." He had gone underground with a shovel and built something that nobody knew was there. He had done it in the summer when his neighbors were watching for his woodpile and a man on horseback was riding past every week calculating his failure. He had filled the underground chamber with 32 cords of dry wood, 1 cord at a time, through September and October, and sealed the door and let February arrive. And when February arrived, the worst February in the county's recorded history, the February that exhausted every conventional preparation and left families burning furniture and men cutting green wood in 30 below temperatures the chamber held. The wood was dry, the cabin was warm, the man inside was not going to Cincinnati. What he had found underground, below the surface of everything, was not just wood. It was what Eleanor had started, what Nels had taught, what Nels's father had taught him and his father before all the way back to some Norwegian winter that nobody living could remember, where a man had stood in a cold that was taking his family and decided to put something useful somewhere the cold could not reach it. The chamber behind the crane cabin is gone now. The timber rotted over the decades after it was last used, and the earth reclaimed the space in the slow, patient way. The earth reclaims all the spaces that human hands have shaped given enough time. There is no marker for it. No historical record specifying exactly where it stood on the north side of the cabin. The cabin itself is gone. The property changed hands many times in the generations after Walter and Margaret, and the people who farm it now did not know what happened there in the summer of 1854, in the winter that followed. But somewhere in Iowa on a February morning, when the temperature drops below zero, and the sky goes that flat iron color, that means it intends to stay below zero, there is probably still a man walking across a yard with no woodpile visible to anyone passing on the road, opening a door in the ground, going down into the dry warmth of a well-built chamber, coming back up with an armful of wood that is exactly as dry as the day it went in, that will burn clean and long and hot, that will hold the cold back through another night and another morning and as many mornings as the winter requires. Not because he read about it somewhere, not because it was required of him, because someone showed him once and he paid attention and he passed it on. That is how useful things survive. That is how they outlast the people who discovered them and the people who built them, and even the structures they were built into lasting past the timber and the stone, and the carefully packed earth persisting at knowledge, traveling from one set of hands to the next patient, and practical and dry, waiting for the next man who needs it and will do the work. That is how these things work. That is how they survive.